HMS Queen Charlotte was a mighty ship. Launched in 1790, the 100-gun first-rate ship of the line was one of the most powerful ships in the most powerful navy of its day. She was the flagship of the Channel Fleet at the largest battle of the French Revolutionary Wars, the scourge of the French Navy. And yet, 223 years ago this week, accident did what the French Navy could not. The website of the Penobscot Maritime Museum was likely being deliberately understated when they said, as one can imagine, wooden ships and fire do not make for a good day at sea. The March 1800 disaster aboard HMS Queen Charlotte deserves to be remembered.
The idea of rating ships of the English Navy goes back as far as the fleet of Henry VIII, whose fleet was divided between ships, galleys, pinnacles, and row barges. It was nearly a century later, during the reign of Charles I, that the system was revised to measure by rank. The ranks were not initially determined by the number of guns that the ship carried, but were an administrative measure based on the size of the crew, and thus the ship's ranks approximated the cost to operate the ship. Smaller vessels might be 4th, 5th, or even 6th rank, but the first rank was reserved for the largest ships, originally called ships royal. Ranks were shown on tables that would help a sovereign determine the costs of keeping ships in service. In fact, a tax that had originated in medieval times, called ship money, intended to pay for royal naval vessels, helped to drive the resentment that would draw England into civil war, eventually resulting in Charles I's execution. The 1660 restoration of the monarchy brought changes, including for the first time the designation Royal Navy. Under Charles II, the system was changed from counting crew to counting gun carriages, a necessary change in that the size of crews had grown substantially, making the old rank tables irrelevant. The size and weight of the guns served as an approximation of the amount of crew the ship would need to carry, and also served to define whether a ship was powerful enough to stand in a line of battle, the typical formation used for fleet engagements from the 17th through the middle 19th century. The system, which had changed terms from ranks to rates, was largely standardized under the famous naval administrator Samuel Pepys. This was a time when the Royal Navy was frequently engaged during the Anglo-Dutch Wars. By the middle of the 18th century, ships considered suitable for the line of battle ranged from third-rate ships carrying 70 to 80 guns, second-rate ships carrying 84 to 98 guns, and first-rate ships carrying at least 100 guns. But in fact, by far the largest number of ships of the line were the third-rate ships. In the 1805 Battle of Trafalgar, during the War of the Third Coalition, one of the largest and most famous engagements of the 19th century between the Royal Navy and the combined Franco-Spanish fleet, the Royal Navy fleet included only 3 first-rate ships, including HMS Victory, flagship of Admiral Horatio Nelson, still preserved in dry dock at Portsmouth Harbor. First-rate ships of the line often served as flagships for admirals and were expensive enough to operate that usually only a handful were kept in service at any given time, and they were usually considered too valuable for distant postings, where second-rate ships served as flagships. So when we talk about the 100-gun, first-rate ship of the line HMS Queen Charlotte, laid down in 1785 and launched in 1790, we are talking about one of the most powerful warships of the day. The pride of the Royal Navy at a time when the Royal Navy only had 4 such vessels. Named after the Queen Consort of George III, built at Chatham Dockyard and designed by master builder Edward Hunt, although built after his death, HMS Queen Charlotte was of the same draft as another first-rate ship of the line, HMS Royal George, constructed simultaneously. Royal George and Queen Charlotte were the 2 largest ships that had ever been constructed for the Royal Navy. In 1794, Admiral Lord Howe chose HMS Queen Charlotte as the flagship of the Channel Fleet, and in that role she was at the heart of the first and largest naval battle of the French Revolutionary Wars, the battle the British called the Glorious 1st of June. While French ships at the time were generally somewhat heavier, the French Navy had been hit hard in the Revolution, with many of its most experienced officers killed or dismissed during the period called the Reign of Terror. The goal of the French commander, Rear Admiral Louis-Thomas Villaret de Joyeuse, did not seek to engage, but rather to draw the British away from a vital convoy of food being sent from America. Having drawn Howe's attention, Villaret de Joyeuse attempted to escape in the night, but Howe had the weather gauge and was able to bring the French to battle. Howe then called for his fleet to engage in an unusual strategy. Instead of sailing in line, Howe ordered his fleet to turn into the French line. It was a gamble. Howe was counting on the inexperienced French gunners to react slowly, allowing the British to close. But Howe's own fleet was confused by the order, and several ships executed the maneuver poorly. But HMS Queen Charlotte was not one of those. Howe took his ship directly into the French center, where she badly mauled Villaret de Joyeuse' flagship, damaged several other ships, and forced one French ship to surrender. The battle was a tactical victory for the Royal Navy, getting the best of the French in the fight, but a strategic loss as the supply convoy successfully got through. A year later, in June of 1795, HMS Queen Charlotte again distinguished herself in the Battle of Groix, playing a central role in chasing down and capturing 3 French ships of the line. HMS Queen Charlotte was a powerful vessel, which had proven itself in combat against the best ships of the French fleet. 5 years later, France and Britain were again at war, this time called the War of the Second Coalition. HMS Queen Charlotte was in the Mediterranean, the flagship of Vice Admiral Lord Keith. On March 16th, Keith left the ship, landing in northern Italy at the port that the English call Leghorn, but the Italians call Livorno, giving orders to the ship's captain, James Todd, to reconnoiter the French-occupied island of Capraia. The ship was still close to shore, quite visible to Lord Keith, when she caught fire. It might seem incongruous to worry about fire while literally on the ocean, but the website Shipping Wonders of the World explains. The chief dread of every old-time seafarer was fire. The reason is simple. The website 1632 explains wooden ships were some of the biggest fire traps ever invented. They're composed of wood, dried with pitch-soaked rope used as caulking, with canvas sails and tarred rope stays. Sailors would have been well aware of the dangers of fire, and in the year 1800, the crew of HMS Queen Charlotte would have been experienced and professional. But dangers always exist. In this case, the cause was a bit of carelessness. A report in the European Magazine and London Review wrote, "The accident was occasioned by the fire of a match, which was kept lighted for the purpose of firing some signal guns, and was communicated to some hay which lay on the half-deck. In enemy waters, the ship kept signal guns at the ready to warn other ships if an enemy was sighted. This meant keeping lit matches, burning rope used to fire cannon, in a bucket. It isn't clear why there was hay on the half-deck, but that might have been bedding straw that was being aired out." Ship's carpenter John Braid made an eyewitness report. About 20 minutes after 6 yesterday morning, he was dressing himself. He heard throughout the ship a general cry of fire, on which he immediately ran up the foreladder to get up on deck, and found the whole half-deck, the front bulkhead in the admiral's cabin, the main mast, and the boats covering the booms, all in flames. The fire spread quickly. The European Magazine and London Review continues. The fire spread very rapidly and burned through the portholes and the hatchway of the ship and soon caught the shrouds. HMS Queen Charlotte was preparing to go underway, was in full sail, and the flame quickly reached the cloth sails. Braid writes, "The mainsail at this time was set and almost entirely caught fire. The people not able to come to the clew garnets, that is, the ropes that attach to the lower part of the sail used to furl it, on account of the flames." On land, Lord Keith could see the fire. The European Magazine and London Review explains, when Lord Keith had the mortification of discovering the Queen Charlotte on fire 4 or 5 leagues at sea, he was almost frantic. He immediately gave orders for all the vessels and boats to be put off, and every assistance to be given. The crew was desperately fighting the blaze. Braid reported that he immediately went to the forecastle and found Lieutenant Dundas and the boatswain encouraging people to get water to extinguish the fire. He applied to Mr. Dundas, seeing no other officer on the forepart of the ship and being unable to see any of the quarterdeck from the flames and smoke between them, to give him assistance to drown the lower decks and to secure the hatches to prevent the fire falling down. Lieutenant Dundas accordingly went down himself with as many people as he could prevail upon to follow him, and the lower deck's ports were opened and the scuppers plugged, the main and fore hatches secured, the cocks turned, and water drawn in at the port, and the pumps kept going by the people who came down, as long as they could stand at them. This was a desperate move. Dundas and some 70 men were trying to flood the lower part of the ship to keep the fire from reaching the ship's powder room. If the fire reached the powder, the explosion would destroy the ship. It was a brave act, placing those men in danger themselves. Antoine Banner, an author who writes about the period, noted on his website, "It must have been hell below decks by that stage. Burning wood and rigging was falling down the hatchways, filling the space with steam as well as smoke. Dundas and his men managed to get the hatches closed and covered with wet hammocks to keep the fire away from the lower deck and magazine." But the fire was raging. The European Magazine and London Review reports, the ship came to an anchor as the wind blew strongly off the land, but the flames were too rapid and that very hopes could be entertained of saving her. Between 8 and 9 o'clock, the mast and rigging caught fire and made an awful blaze. The crew, however, cut the mast by the board, and going over the ship, they no longer threatened mischief. But the fire had taken strong hold of the body of the vessel and continued to rage. Below decks, Dundas and his men did the best they could. Braid reported, "He thinks that by their exertions the lower deck was kept free from fire and the magazines preserved for a long time from danger. Nor did Lieutenant Dundas or he quit the station, but remained there with all the people who they could avail upon to stay until several of the middle deck guns came through the deck. The men had bravely protected the vital lower decks, but as the ship burned, the heavy guns from the deck above fell through the deck, and the crew could no longer protect the lower deck. Some of those guns were cooking off, that is, powder inside was going off. This had a terrible effect, as the European Magazine and London Review explains. The people in the boats and other vessels who had gone from Leghorn were so alarmed for fear of the shot that they would not approach the ship. Their concern that they were at risk from the cannons caught in the fire was not, in fact, warranted, as European Magazine and London Review explains. But, in fact, the danger was not so great as the people of the vessels from Leghorn imagined, for the guns were not shotted, it never having been the custom of Lord Keith or his captain to have the guns shotted till they were going into action. This meant that the rescue vessels with Lord Keith were deterred not only from helping to fight the fire, but from rescuing the crew. There were, however, other heroic acts, notable because some of the men involved had been part of the Spithead Mutiny in 1797. The European Magazine and London Review continues. Here we must mention that some of the Queen Charlotte's own crew, who had rowed Lord Keith to shore, and particularly some of the men who were principal mutineers 3 years ago at Spithead, behaved with the most generous bravery. Despising all danger, they approached the ship and saved many of their gallant countrymen. There were some American boats nearby as well, and some of their crews braved the flames to rescue members of the crew. Among those was the brave Lieutenant Dundas, Braid reported. He continued about an hour on the forecastle, and finding all efforts to extinguish the flames unavailing, he jumped from the jib boom and swam to an American boat approaching the ship, by which he was picked up. But too few boats came. The European Magazine and London Review laments. But unfortunately, the impression was made on the minds of the persons near the Queen Charlotte that the guns occasioned going off were loaded with shot, and nothing could remove their fears, or do some to approach the ship. Otherwise, the whole crew might have been saved. Hundreds of men climbed out on the bowsprit, and some of the Italian boatsmen came close enough to save many of them as well. But many found no such respite. Among them the ship's captain, Andrew Todd, whose efforts to save his ship were unrecorded, dying, apparently with him, and 672 other officers and men of his crew. The European Magazine and London Review writes, the ship continued to burn about 4 hours, and at 11 o'clock it blew up with a tremendous explosion. She sunk, and in a moment left not a wreck behind.
The Royal Navy did not mourn the loss of the ship for very long. In 1810, a new 104-gun ship of the line was christened HMS Queen Charlotte. Lieutenant Dundas's heroism that day was recognized, and he was given his own command, a sixth-rate ship. By the time that he retired, he was a rear admiral in command of the ship of the line. He served in Parliament, and in August of 1834 was made First Naval Lord, making him the head of the Royal Navy, although he passed away just 2 months later. The loss of one of the greatest ships in the world to something as trivial as some matches and some straw really represents the risks of the age of sail. In fact, fire is still a great risk aboard ships today. But the loss of the 673 officers and crew of HMS Queen Charlotte really represents a much larger number, because as the website Shipping Wonders of the World notes, fire likely accounts for around half of all vessels in history that have been listed as missing, which means the ghosts of the men who died aboard HMS Queen Charlotte might represent as many as hundreds of thousands of other mariners who faced a similar fate, and yet most of whose stories are lost to history. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguyguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on Forgotten History, all you have to do is subscribe.